you. Thank you, Eva Maria. Thank you for inviting me to moderate this panel. And this panel also associates with the video how integration has changed over the last 30 years from the point of view of the state, the society, politics. But today we will focus in this panel with the participants on how we have measured and monitored integration through academic research. I'm very pleased to invite on stage the panelists. I would like to start with Triin Vihalem. She is from the University of Tartu, and she has studied integration over the last couple of decades or so. Well, yes, about 20 years. Please take a seat. I'm very pleased to invite Raivo Vetik from Tallinn University, and he has already been introduced today, and he has also studied integration, ethnic relations in Estonia, and he has been involved in the integration monitoring from the very beginning, since 2000. Welcome. And I'd also like to invite my colleague Kats Kivistik from the Institute of Baltic Studies, and she has also been involved in integration monitoring over the last 5 or so years. Welcome. And hopefully we will also connect to Marju Lauristin over a video link. Can you hear us? Yes? Hello. Marju has studied integration for a number of years and been involved in integration monitoring surveys from the very start. I'll also take a seat, as I'm very much interested in integration and have been involved in the monitoring over the last 10 years, and I have participated with these monitorings and the surveys and research, so I'll just speak of my own experience, what I have noticed, and then I will carry on with the panel. So I'd like to start with integration as a term. How did it occur in Estonia, and how did we start monitoring and measuring it the way we do it since 2000? And we'd like to wrap up the panel with a question and discussion: where next? How should we define integration and measure it in the future? And do we continue in the same way of how it's been done over the last 20 years, or perhaps we should introduce some fundamental changes so that the processes that we heard of in the first panel today, where there are many interpretations, there's quite a lot of critique, how integration is defined, the different concepts of integration, how could we improve things in Estonia and develop them further. But as for the monitorings, if you haven't come across them before and read the surveys, then the video had the titles. So the integration monitoring has been carried out in Estonia since the year 2000. So we have a celebration, 20 years since we've regularly, systematically monitored integration and carried out the surveys. So we've had 8 of these surveys. They're not carried out every year, but every 3 years or so. And it is one of the most sustainable surveys in Estonia that has been carried out. We also have defense-related monitoring by the Ministry of Defense, but the integration one is a second one that has quite a long-term history in Estonia. So this is a research instrument that we have asked since 2000. Those questions they cover different topics: labor market, language skills. These have all been mentioned, and as was mentioned in the video, how in the first years we asked about security, prostitution, crime-related issues, whether different nationalities have a positive or negative effect on these, and then these topics in the same context. Integration depends on context. It depends on the background. So these were the questions that are asked in the monitoring. Media use, employment, so how the media, trusting the media, watching different media channels. We've also studied the contacts between people, how they have changed. So there are quite a number of questions and topics that are covered, and if you're interested, then please do read the monitoring itself and the summaries. So obviously we cannot compare the questions. Some questions have disappeared compared to the year 2000. So every year the questions are reviewed, new questions are introduced, old questions are taken out. But there are certain topics where we can look at the timeline over 20 years. Language skills, citizenship issues, whether people value Estonian citizenship, Estonian passports, and the pragmatic aspects. People often don't want to become citizens. They can, so citizenship was actually an obstacle. So contacts have improved, language skills as well have improved, etc. But the monitoring itself is not aimed at the ethnic minorities and those who are not Estonian speakers, because we also look at the attitudes of Estonians, how the Estonian speakers' attitudes have changed. So we get a comparative analysis of different groups and which are the bits that they share, what are the parts that are in common, and whether there is a common path. And over the last few years, the monitorings have also included some pragmatic topics, questions that are related to access to services, objectives to these, whether it's language skills, be they the unemployment fund services, internet access, etc. So these are issues that have come up at the last monitoring in 2020, the service design aspects that we have never tackled before. So the monitoring itself, just like integration, is a process that has changed over the last couple of decades, and as researchers and academics we also have to adapt to the times and the situation and make certain modifications, and hopefully we will get to this at the end of our panel. New target groups have been included in the monitoring survey. So if at first 20 years ago we looked at two groups, Estonian speakers and the others, so to say, who were the non-Estonian speaking minority, then over the last surveys we have included new groups. Professor Favel talked about Estonians living abroad. The monitoring has included those who have returned to Estonia, so ethnic Estonians who have returned to live in Estonia, so how do they fit in with the different topics. And the new immigrants, those who have newly arrived in Estonia over the last 5 years, so that's a new target group of the survey. So the last two monitorings have introduced these groups, and who knows, maybe we will include the Estonian diaspora, all the different groups of people either within Estonia, living here on the territory of Estonia, or outside. So this was my short overview of the history of the monitoring surveys. In case you have any questions, please type them into the workshop environment. Any ideas and thoughts that you have, comments, we would like to answer them. But I'd like to give the floor to our panelists as well, finally. So, processes in Estonia 25 years ago, when it was decided that integration in the Estonian society something that we're starting to deal with? And how do we define and how do we measure integration? How did it all start? We use the word integration. That's the term. Now we have an Estonian word for it. So how did this term come into the academic knowledge? Because we know that the different concepts, the ethno-political regimes, they have different notions. For example, Sami Smuhan from Israel has said that in Estonia it wasn't integration, but it was ethnic democracy, that one dominating group had all the best positions of power in the economy or in politics. But the academia used the term integration. So if you could open this for us, those of you who were involved. Marju, I'd perhaps like to give the floor to you. We agreed that we are on a first name basis. Marju, on the other side of the screen there, could you please then just comment briefly?
Thank you. I'll try to do that. Well, speaking about 30 years is a little bit cheating, because 1991, at that time, the story of two Estonians was a totally different story. The polarization and all that. We were in this situation of decolonization, and one of the main problems for the Baltic countries was that the former colonizing nation had all of a sudden become the dominated minority, which means that it caused many psychological problems, and these issues became quite sharp sometimes. And it was at the time when the Act of Aliens was passed, and in that situation it was also obvious that part of the people who had lived in Estonia were all of a sudden shut out from the content of the Republic of Estonia, without even knowing what will happen to them. And it was then the topic of integration was created or cropped up in Estonia. And at that time, the Nordic Council had a very important role, because they were the one who were pushing these issues, and a working group was set up with the support of the Nordic Council. And at that time, we were trying to find the theoretical starting point. And John Barry, at that time, seemed to be the closest to us culturally and perhaps less politically involved. And we didn't want this range of topics to be over-politicized from the very beginning. And John Barry started to explain the situation in the society, speaking about the notion of segregation as such, and in the seminars we organized for the members of our working group, we tried to understand what would be the reactions to all this. And it was obvious that we did have two very different communities living in Estonia, and it was the divide was language-based at that time. And the first project we carried out, that was setting up the Integration Foundation, and we had very many campaigns, and I still remember the campaign which was called Many Wonderful People. So these were big posters all over the town with pictures of different nationalities. And it was obvious from that time on that we need to communicate with each other. And we had sociologists, psychologists included, and at that time we understood that integration is a social concept. It's not only about the language, it's not only about the citizenship. We are speaking here of the need for involvement, and it is clearly a part of integration. And at that time we had a Minister of Popular Affairs, and the function of that minister was to understand the needs of different ethnic groups, and that means that from then on the domination of language or citizenship in integration lost its predominant meaning. And this is something that characterizes the first period best. Monitoring started later, it was 2000, and from those monitorings we understand that yes, integration has a very rich social content, and it is acute up to the present day. Yes, and of course, theoretically in the beginning, the notion of integration was a very political understanding of how to develop the society. And nowadays we understand that politics should not have such important role as the content of integration. Raivo Vetik, you have been there in those discussions about integration from the very beginning. What Mario has mentioned now, this political aspect, how important was that in the debates? We have had many of those debates, and Mario is still debating on these issues, and that's very, very good, because we can't avoid that totally, that's clear. But in the beginning, we took this very pragmatic or practical approach, and we divided the integration field into three. First, cultural linguistic aspect, social economical, and lastly, political legal sphere. And by these topics, we started to, let's say, fill the monitoring questionnaire. And they mentioned John Berry was there, but we also had two other authors who participated. John Rex from UK, an English sociologist, and he brought with him the conception of the difference or the divide between public sphere and state, private and public. And we tried to show those different relations, and based on that we also worded our questions that we considered to be important at that time. And when I recall the first monitoring in the year 2000, the most scandalous question, and also the answer, you can't get a scandalous answer if the question itself is not scandalous. And what appeared was that 46% of ethnic Estonians believed that Estonian Russians should migrate. That was the beginning. And it was a totally different world compared to where we live now. Can I get a slide number 1 on the screen to illustrate a little bit what we had in the year 2000? Speaking about monitoring. And I brought out one of the examples, was also clear from the video. And I tried to get some very illustrative points from the monitoring of 2000. Yes, this is the year 2000. I don't know how well you can see what's here, but this is how integration was tried to conceptualize, to understand what does it mean to integrate. And the question was, do you think that the presence of different nationalities in Estonia helps too? And then there is a list of different spheres, culture and so on. And, for example, to enrich the temperament and characteristics of Estonian nation. And the next slide here shows, well, these are the questions asked. For example, the question whether the lifestyle and mindset of Estonian Russians differs very much from the ethnic Estonians. And then there was a question, who are you by nationality? And it was possible to give only one answer to this question. So it was all about finding out the identity of the people in Estonia. And we even excluded the possibility of people giving several answers. So whom do you feel to be? So, and then there was also the question about what do you think should be the representation in Estonian governance bodies be? Well, by the way, this is also relevant today. So if we look at the 20 last years, some topics are still relevant, some have become unimportant. And for example, the ratio of non-Estonians in different governance bodies or local governments, for example, it is still very important today. And now I ask your comment for those questions from 2000. Do you think that these questions at that time, asked as they were they justified? Should these questions be asked also today? Thank you. I think that these questions reflect very well the then expectations in the society. To show where we live, where we are. I can't call it the starting point because there were smaller or bigger surveys conducted also earlier. So we have studied our society also earlier. So sort of a portrait of Estonia had been there also before. So from that point of view, the integration monitoring was not the first attempt to try to identify the portrait of Estonia. It was more like national curiosity, perhaps, to learn more what we are. And like, for example, the moderator also said that some of these questions were scandalous or curious outcomes. But this was the way we had to get through in order to get where we are now. And for example, at that time, the belief that integration is only one direction movement, by now almost everybody accepts that it is actually a two-way traffic. And well, just like Raivo said today, that the social, psychological aspect has been there all the time. There are two groups who either get on very well between each other or they don't get on at all. And well, through this realization, we have come to the understanding that integration is based on relations between people, between individuals. And, for example, the aims set to integration, for example, how many people we have to be able to convert into Estonian citizens, meaning the legal understanding of what is a citizen of Estonia and the passport and everything. So, in a certain way, it was all very natural and logical that these were the steps we had to take, and I'm very happy that by now this approach has changed completely, and we understand that through this changed view on integration, the whole society wins. And just like you yourself said, that quite many questions in the monitoring have changed and the picture has become more colorful. And one of the landmarks for me, 10 years after the first monitoring, there was a very clear change if in corpora we were now moving on this path of integration. It all of a sudden started to change, and when Mario came in with the integration and social groups, so it appeared that yes, the movement, the path of integration is different from different social groups. And Raivo also said, for example, the agencies. So we started to understand that yes, people have different agendas, people have different let's say, agencies to achieve what they want to achieve in the society as an ethnic group, but also as an individual. And there is a different skill to achieve what you want. Knowing the rules is one thing, but it also means that you have to have the will to move on and constructive approach to get what you want. I would add one more word into the discussion, and this word is ethnocentrism. And at that time it was something unavoidable. If you come from the Soviet society, ethnocentrism at that time was something that was there. So it divides the world into two, they and us. They are the bad ones, we are the good ones. And this was a very good example of the social construction. It was a very good study material in a way. And in the 90s, we were very clearly ethnocentric in our approach, and I don't want to say that we are not so anymore, but I would say that ethnocentrism doesn't necessarily have to be only negative. It can also be positive, but you have to not to overdo. Yes, but now if you look at these questions now, they seem quite funny. Thank you.
Could I ask the tech support to put up my next slide? As Trine mentioned the term, the different clusters of integration, and Mario who created these, but this slide indicates the different concepts and typologies that have been used in the monitorings since 2000. So we have different scholars, Raivo Vetik, Trine Vihalem, Marju Lauristin. So each of the names also lists the dates. Jüri Kruuswald, 2002. So the different concepts of interpreting the results of the monitoring through the different concepts and typologies. So the different clusters. Then Raivo introduced the national identity. Trine, you have used the term the dimensions of identity, the importance of the religion index, media preferences, the different types, exclusion index. So there are quite a number of these terms, and how we've tried to interpret the results and put them into the framework. So we've had this academic debate, or researchers, they find it interesting how to bind together these different results. And this is also input into the politics, actually. So when Mario created these integration clusters, then they also were used in the different strategies, the integration strategy, the integration plans. So they looked at different base levels, how those different clusters and indicators have changed over the decades. And on the basis of this, we've tried to access whether integration in the Estonian society has worked or not, whether politicians have used it. So Raivo has used this national identity term, which has also been used in the different strategies. So Marju, coming back to you and then to Raivo, so when thinking of those different typologies and creating them and coming back to these integration clusters, could you just comment why? Were you just thinking as researchers that analytically this might be something to analyze, or were you also thinking in terms of policy organizing? Well, as sociologists, we opposed ourselves to the politicians. So we still hear about two different groups, that we have 1 million Estonians and then, well, about 300,000 Russian speakers living in Estonia. So how do we integrate them? So as a sociologist, then this was sort of alien to us. So for us, we were dealing with a society that was changing, and so these clusters, they were based on different things, and there were different patterns, different groups. So we tried to implement the same methodology that we used in the previous surveys. So using demographic characteristics and the different characteristics that make people belong into one particular group or cluster. And so the three main dimensions, they were already mentioned. So again, those characteristics that form the three dimensions, but also adding the attitudes, for example. And it was very clear that there is no such thing that all the Russian speakers have the same policies. No, there are quite large differences, and in modern terms there are those who play a large role, the Russian speakers, and yes, they speak a different language, but they also have different opportunities. And then the cluster that is visible among Estonians, those who have completely pushed out of the society, they are passive, they don't know what's happening, so they are completely alien. So this cluster analysis, it indicates that it is not a narrow ethnic issue, but it is a cohesion issue of the society. So the language aspect, the ethnic background, is just one dimension, and sociologists have often said that this ethno-social stratification is something that is in Estonia. Language, culture, and this intertwines with all the other factors. So the term of integration, in this narrow meaning, integrating the Russian speakers into the Estonian society, so this is not quite right. Thank you. Just a provoking question to you, Raivo. Why did we abandon this cluster theory and we moved on to the national identity? Was this reaction to the changes in the society or changes in the academia, in the theoretical framework? So what brought this on? It's also a matter of the different disciplines. Sociology, politology, they are different. So I was very critical at first about this cluster analysis, and that from the point of view of my discipline. So what are these integration clusters? I think there were 7 or so characteristics, and these characteristics are from very different domains: language skills, citizenship, attitudes, etc. And when we put these together, then as a politologist you ask, what is this number about? What does it mean? And people's opinions are based on their position on the social field and on the political field. So this is the Durkheim concept of social representations, that our ideas, our opinions, they don't just sort of fall upon us randomly, but they reflect our interests, our positions. So my idea was that if we create an index of some sort, then it must be based on one domain. Then we can also understand what we are trying to say. Well, I have to admit that I cannot understand what Marju is saying and what she is talking about, and I have said that to her many times, and she just laughs. Just the same is happening now. We are people of different disciplines, and we represent different domains. People are different. Mario, would you like to comment? Well, yes, it is a matter of different domains. So yes, sciences and research fields are different, so that is the difference between sociology and politology. Trine, would you like to give your point of view? Well, as a communications specialist and researcher of communication theories, then it's not a matter of positions that have to be set in stone. And when Raivo says that he doesn't understand, well, I don't believe him, actually. It's a matter of what you consider dominant. If Raivo thinks that people have this national identity or state identity, and again I would like to say that yes, we have a citizen's identity, that we're not subjects of our state. So maybe it's this Orientalist concept. So, Raivo, you kind of opposing yourself. These fields, they consist of different dimensions, and this political field, with its position, it is linked to our everyday lives. And the more we come to the human beings level, then, well, think of the position of that who's in power, or we have the education system here, and then this is the market, so to say, and this is the political system. But on our everyday life, take something very basic, cooking dinner in the evening. You have energy, you have the education system, everything that is in that bowl that you're using. So different positions from the economic point of view, from the political point of view. So those clusters on the political field, citizenship, well, people didn't have this agency, this agent point of view, or when voting at the parliamentary elections, for example, you could not everybody could participate. So it's doing things that are common, and different societies and cultural groups. So these agencies, they play a role. Capitals can convert itself, if we put it into business terms. So it's a multi-dimensional issue from our point of view and the agency point of view, not from the ruler's point of view, so to say. I understand that we try to put it into a system, and that these regimes had a different system, but from the everyday point of view, it is quite a network of things. I do agree with Trine, but it's not the state identity, but as I translate it into English, it's the national identity. So in Estonia we don't have a term for it. So in Estonia, nation is an ethnic group. So yes, national is the national identity, and this is an issue when we look at things from the point of view of Estonians, that for us the nation state and our cultural basis is that the nation is one and the ethnicity is one. So in English, the national identity, in Estonian we use the term state identity index, so it's not the state view. So why not citizens' identity? Well, yes, perhaps. That's a good point. Why didn't you come up with this idea before? So we should probably rewrite the integration plan. But concepts change and theories change and our society changes. We have a number of processes that influence it, and there are certain, well, major events that have taken place, and over the last 20 years that we've carried out the surveys, there have been 4 or 5, well, not just Estonia related, but global breaking points. If we start from the beginning, then of course the relocation of the Second World War Memorial, the so-called Bronze Soldier incident, in 2007 when we were carrying out the monitoring and we were putting together the questions, and then this event happened and we had another meeting in Tartu, and then I was new to this and new to this world of surveys, and for me it was very interesting to view how experienced researchers suddenly became very confused. So things that we were writing before, that we should completely discard that and start writing things from scratch. So how should we ask the questions about integration? And then we actually had to change the questions. Then at the late 2000s we had the economic crisis, 2008 to 2010, then Ukraine, Crimea, 2014, then the migration crisis, in inverted commas, and then 2020 with COVID, the new crisis. So Guts, this question is addressed to you. When we look at the different changes in the society and those different crises and the breaking points that have happened, how do you view, can this monitoring survey, is it following with the changes in time, and do the questions give adequate answers depending on the different groups of the society? So do we get an adequate view of how Estonians view and how other nationalities view things? What are your thoughts?
This is very difficult to give one clear answer, but when I look at the questions of the monitorings and the answers provided, we see that there is a clear change after each crisis, and perhaps the answers given by one group have changed more than the others, but the crises are reflected very well in those monitoring results. And we do see the mirroring, be it, for example, the last corona crisis and the contacts between people. We see that the number of contacts has decreased, and we also see that contacts between different ethnic groups have become more important in the public or work-related field. And then during COVID, we saw a change there that perhaps related to workplace, it became less visible, but between individuals it became more important. How do you feel? You have been connected with 2 or 3 monitorings. These crises, do they enhance or somehow change the situations unproportionally, or bring some aspects up unproportionally much? For example, the crises, do they impact ethnic Estonians the same way they impact other nationality groups? Yes, generally speaking, as the economic structure, I would say economic structure first and foremost is different. Ethnic Estonians have somewhat better jobs, white-collar jobs, and for them the possible crises don't have that big impact or effect. But economic crises influence more people on lower workplaces. Unemployment grows very quickly there, so groups who are socially speaking weaker, they are affected more. And well, we know that there is a clear overpresence of minority representatives among these groups. I think that this is a very interesting thing. Well, you can say that we knew that beforehand, and the crises do have an impact on the results of the questionnaires. And for example, if we look at the data coming from northeast Estonia or Lasnamäe, which are predominantly Russian-speaking territories, so there are very many people who have to go physically to their workplaces. They can't do distant or remote work because of the well, content of their work. And something that we also see when you look at the monitorings, we were speaking about the cohesion in the society. We haven't asked questions about the attitudes towards health in different ethnic groups. And this may be something that is general. I mean that certain nationalities or ethnic groups may have a more fatalist understanding on life. So from that point of view, it seems to be that cultural background plays a very important role. It's not just the economic or, let's say, state-related aspects, but also cultural aspects that influence the behavior of people in the crisis. And, for example, during the crisis, one of the factors which otherwise seem to be not so important all of a sudden becomes so big, and that's the issue of health. Raivo, Triin, do you have some thoughts you'd want to share about the crisis and the influence of the crisis on integration and monitoring? Yes, as a small vignette. So it is something that clearly influences the way people answer these monitoring interviews. For example, the bronze night and the language skills of Estonia. After the bronze night, the language skills of non-Estonians seem to go down, which is a little bit illogical. The interviews, they are actually real interviews because the people who carry out the monitoring, they meet the people, they ask those questions. So it is communication between two people. And we have examples where the media research was carried out at the same time with the monitoring. And questions sometimes asked in those two different monitorings or interviewings were similar, but answers given were different, which means that sometimes the political undertone may influence. For example, if you ask a question about the 9th of May, well, if it is asked in another neutral situation, you may get a different answer. So the exact moment of time when the interview is done can also influence the results, even if the instrument or the tool is the same. So we come back again to the same thing that was mentioned several times today. Context is important, and context also influences the answers, the self-image of the people answering these questions. And speaking about different crises, and especially now the health crisis, we don't have very fresh data now, but in principle, I think that, well, about 10 years ago, there was a crisis communication research done, and that showed us also that people had very different understanding of crises. It was in a totally different context. It had nothing to do with integration, but we found out that if for Estonian speakers the mass media based communication and exchange of information seemed to be important, then in Russian speaking people, they didn't directly avoid the institutions or let's say official public information, but they valued more the information they get through personal contacts. For example, that I'd like to make a call to somebody, I'd like to ask an expert, I'd like to find it out from somebody. So it was more individual. So that was the big difference between Estonian speaking and Russian speaking group. And probably it has something to do with what Mario mentioned already, that in the times of crisis the cultural backgrounds become more important, or at least it is revealed more openly. And well, whether the information and communication you expect to get during the crisis, is it like one source, official information based, or is it more like broader, getting different ideas and for example, even the vaccination issue, it's a very dynamic question, so it depends a lot to whom you are speaking, it depends a lot where you do it, and it seems to be a very modern or fashionable example right now. People have like dug in themselves in those trenches, so you either believe in it or you are against it, and people show actually signs of getting tired of debating on these issues. I believe in it and that's it. So you have also been, Raivo, with those monitorings for about 20 years. How do you think the crisis or the elements connected with crisis influence the outcomes? Yes, I have an example that the crisis can actually have a positive impact on the relations between Estonians and Russian-speaking people. 2015, for example, the monitoring we had in autumn, and before that it was the Ukrainian, let's say, political conflict, and how did that influence the politics and the neighboring countries of Ukraine. And the hypotheses were that the relations between Estonians and Russians would suffer because of that, or get worse. And something that was surprising was that actually Russian-speaking group identified much more with the official point of view of Estonia. That means that they placed themselves on the side of the international good guys, so to say, and it shows that well, in this case we understood that nobody in Estonia, be whatever your language of communication is, wanted Estonia to become something like well, Maidan. So, and that was the influence of that crisis on Estonian integration at that time. And when Trine was saying that the context is important and the background is important when we get answers to the monitoring questions, what questions we ask and in the which form we ask them, whether we call it the integration monitoring or we call it the media monitoring, even the chosen terminology can influence the given answers. Have you felt that it does impact the results? And if yes, is there something we can do about it so that this factor and its influence can demolish? I would, yes, even use the term here, population monitoring, so that we don't emphasize this let's say, existence of different groups beforehand already. So, and when we have the monitoring, it's very important what is the sample. Then And later, when we interpret the results, either in the future, for example, when they are going to interpret the outcomes of today's monitoring, of course, they see it through their eyes with the knowledge they have it at that time, but they have to accept the situation right now, what is the context now when these questions were asked. And, well, again, from the scientific point of view, then you can decide whether these were important enough factors or not.
Marju, if we talk about the term integration and the Estonian term that we use, lõimumine, we actually use this Estonian term, but in Russian we don't. How do you comment on that? Well, the word itself, the meaning of the word, in Russian integration, it has this ring to it that the Russians feel that they are the objects of this process. So they are the ones being integrated. And when we look at Russian social media or the mainstream media, talking to people, then the word integration in Russian, it has a sort of a negative connotation. And that is why, well, when looking at the future surveys, then we should use a different word. In Estonian, the term integration, it means other things as well. It means the social integration, intertwining things, linking things together. This is what the term is about. And as the last monitoring showed, then we haven't set this target, whether it's spatial integration or the attitudes were very different. So yes, it's a cohesion of the society, and this cohesion is what we have studied as well in the monitorings. But can we still use the same questions, or do we use a different term instead of integration? Well, as for this, using the same questions, well, that's a value in itself, that you reuse the questions, because then otherwise we don't have a timeline. And this is what we've done. We've slightly changed, adapted the questions, but there should be a certain set of questions that are the same, that they are formed in the same way. Well, the context may slightly change, but the questions should still remain the same. So what is the current trend and what should it be? Can we actually state things out loud? Well, yes, we can make conclusions over regarding one survey, but 20 years of monitoring, is 20 years enough that we can see that there has been a change in people wanting to become citizens of Estonia, in language skills? That's a technical skill, but attitudes and such issues. Well, it's an interesting question. I looked at the questions of 2000, and I thought that it would be very interesting to take the exact same questions. And you say to people that, well, we repeat the questions, but I think that the results would show us that there have been major changes in the society. Triin, we've discussed this about the different topics of the monitoring, and you have been fairly critical about how we measure integration. So your thoughts? Should we repeat the survey questions of 2000 and see what the results are, or do we sort of carry on the same way, or should we look at things and try and measure everything in numbers and figures, or take a completely different trend? Well, it should be a hybrid, perhaps, that some questions from the 2000 survey should be kept, because we should be curious still about things. So if curiosity disappears, then why do things in the first place? But the reason why I have been critical is not that the idea of this monitoring survey is a bad idea. Yes, it is research-based and evidence-based, and it has also linked scientists together even when they argue about issues. So it's a good reason for researchers to come together and talk about these issues and have this. But as for the implementational aspect, then yes, certain question could be repeated after a certain time, let's say, and then we sort of have a whole set of questions and then pull out. But as for the practical approach and how do we increase the cohesion within the society, then our society has developed. We've moved on. There is, well, we have good samples, and we should just, include different domains, which may mean that there are greater responsibilities, no matter which ministry we include. But let's say that we present the results on this social field, and gives us a better insight into things as well. So we can use the results in the policy making as well. I'll just try and give an illustrative example. It doesn't mean that this is something we have to do. I have a student who's interested in the topic of cultural integration. So we've talked about media, but culture, mass culture, culture itself, and this student is saying that creative people, that there is no cohesion, that every society gets its input from cultural people who work in the cultural sphere. So creative people with Russian backgrounds, they have not integrated into the Estonian society. So on this cultural field, there is no cohesion, there is no sort of natural communication. And perhaps this is something that we could have, not from the point of view of how we consume culture. So just as an example, so we can draw an example from any type of a domain. So this might also inspire researchers, that how we interpret integration from different points of view. And this is also something that makes us more modern as a society. When we look at the different fields that Raivo told us about this morning, the different people, the agents that they are, where perhaps the national characteristic is one, the ethnic characteristic is one aspect. So I would sort of support these sort of domain-related researches, that surveys that could be repeated over time. Marju, yes, I'd just like to add. Yes, we should perhaps, diversify the methods. So, like in Europe, the social studies, that you have certain blocks of questions, but then the focus slightly changes. For example, just the cultural cohesion that was just mentioned. Big data, analyzing big data. So everything is digitalized these days, the data, and we could look at media texts and draw the analysis from there. Drin mentioned this, and in addition to this, the qualitative analysis, so the qualitative study. And another domain is education. So when looking at education and schools, so the why question, why Russian schools, Estonian schools, so why the PISA test results are different. So here we don't have evidence-based answers. Why is it so that the results are different? So education is a domain, and putting that into the focus is very important. And as for health-related behavior, then this is also a critical issue. But yes, I'd add this education aspect. And qualitative surveys have to be financed, and they should be part of cohesion research and surveys, and the state should fund these as well. And these are topics that are important to us as a country. Kats, you have carried out different surveys to the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Culture, and different organizations that are part of the ministries. So how do you feel these single surveys, do they give a clear idea of integration, or is it something that the client hasn't considered important? They look at things within a certain framework, and as for the different ethnic differences, then these things are overlooked. Well, it depends on the survey. Some do not stress the individual level at all, but one of the trends that we notice is ethnicity. Citizenship is something that is always asked, and looking at certain groups of the society that are not so well off, then yes, we see that they are from a particular ethnic group. But I do agree with what Marju said, that big data, approaching it through big data and in a qualitative way as well, approaching people's attitudes. What about the new target groups? So if thinking of future monitoring surveys, Marju said that yes, cohesion studies and the national program of cohesion studies, that's a good idea. But do we need to include new target groups? And this is what I mentioned at first, that what hasn't been studied previously, if thinking of the future, should we try and attract these new groups, those who return to Estonia, new immigrants, because those Estonians who come back to Estonia, they face maybe the same issues as foreigners who move to Estonia. So maybe we should include a wider Estonian diaspora. Well, yes, they're all part of our society. And as for these qualitative studies, or in other ways, we should focus on the younger people, whether we see any new processes. Marju, you wanted to comment? Yes, speaking of target groups, so we often in integration, we don't often want to speak about citizens of Russia who live in Estonia. It's something that we don't want to deal with because we are afraid that this might cause some tension. But looking in the future 10 years, so there will not be any people left in Estonia who have this so-called alien's passport. So for now, they still remain quite a large group, and there are young people who also have this so-called unidentified citizenship. But in the current situation and with our relations with our neighbor, we should consider this as an important. We have some questions at the workshop environment, and in case you have any questions to ask. But as for the quality of the data, the question is whether in the future we should change the methodology of how data is collected, not just change the questions, but the actual methodology. Triin also answered this, that we should have combined ways. And Raivo, do you have anything to comment on the quality of the data that we have? Are they reliable? So when we carry out the monitoring, then the Russian-speaking population is overrepresented, so perhaps we should try and provide better statistical analysis, but you have come up with your indices as well. Is the data reliable?
We have tried to do as best as we can. And as a Russian-speaking population in Estonia is overrepresented in our monitoring, it's because of the statistical needs. But of course it is connected with a wider problem. And what does it mean in the social scientific aspect? There have been very many debates, and there are people who say that it is only qualitative research which gives you some sort of an idea about the reality, and the quantitative is not so important. But the research that I have been doing, their objective is more like, well, church in the middle of the village. So you can't interpret the answer given to the question in the same way. So sometimes a similar answer given by different people may mean a totally different thing. I would like to emphasize also that there are many important leaps. First of all, what people say, knowing that they are answering the monitoring question. The other thing is their general attitude, and the third aspect may be how does this very same person react in a real practical situation, in real life. And that's why in the sense of conducting a survey, you have to avoid perhaps people who have those very strong attitudes, which means that they overshade their objectivity. Yes, attitudes and real behavior and how you put that into words, that may be different. But in a way, perhaps we overemphasize the importance of that. It has always been there that people may say one thing and mean another. But for us, it is important to find out what are the trends, what are the tendencies, and that's what we'd like to see. Well, the behavior of groups or masses. And when we speak about statistics, then statistics probably gives us a more adequate picture. And statistics is very much interested how many people we have in reality nowadays in the public services, of such people who come from Russian cultural background, from Russian-speaking schools. And when we do that statistically, we see that medium or top-level managers in public services, they may have Russian names, but in the language or linguistic and communicative sense, they behave as Estonians. And this is the case when statistics doesn't show us the real situation. Thank you. Now we have 3 minutes left, and I'll read out the question that was asked from the audience. Have you ever thought about making it into a longitude study? What would be the pluses and minuses of that? Longitude, for those who want to know, that you ask the same question continuously. 1 year, next year, 2 years afterwards, you still ask the same questions. What do you think about that kind of approach in monitoring integration? The first pragmatic idea I have, so you have to have a very big sample because people get tired. And, well, I have tried to conduct sort of a mini longitude myself, but very many people of the primary sample, they fall out. But anyway, it would be quite exciting to see the results because the integration clusters, we heard about that earlier, so they show you sort of patterns or, well, we know that these clusters are there, but people may move from one cluster to the other, and that means that their opinions and attitudes also change because of that. So research based on individuals and to see their changes would be quite exciting. Yeah, but it means that one should have considerably more resources for carrying out research like that. And on the other hand, what are the, not shortcomings, but let's say negative aspects of such sort of research? It may bring back a little bit more of this social psychological aspect and then we start having again a new context interpretation because now you have to consider the real background of the person who gives you the answers and you can't say that this is a neutral representation of the society because it is one individual who may have a totally different situation at that moment of being asked. And if it is the same people all the time and you start asking the same questions, well, you end up with this, let's say, how many people have you left by the end of this longitudinal survey, and whether they will be representative enough. And sometimes you may even get this extra influence that these people who answer, they try to be extra loyal, so they are starting to manipulate their own answers. I think that this could be done in the question of education, because here you can actually choose a group of students, and to be a pupil or a student in a school is actually time-limited phenomenon already. And for example, when you study a group of secondary school and after that you follow their route or their path on the labor market or, well, whatever way their lives roll out, boys or girls. But that could be a good idea. Thank you, Mario. Thank you, Kats, Raivo, Triin. I had a very interesting discussion with you. Hopefully also the audience appreciated the ideas you spoke about, and hopefully there will be many well, wishes to get more and more research and the scientists come forth with more and more interesting ideas in the future. Thank you. Thanks to everybody.